here. You see the rhetoric again?
Life, and you can believe it, you can bank on it. And of course, there are going to be things that you have to work at to understand it. It's not like God didn't want us to work at things. One of the things Augustine used to say is the clear stuff's there so that, by it we may be fed, have salvation, and so forth. And then there are other things there that God put so that we would have something to do, in a sense. I don't think he meant it in a flippant way. He's just saying that to exercise us, right? We're to be.
Oh, so he appealed to Augustine to prove that the Catholic Church, when I say Catholic, all of you guys are Catholic, you call yourselves Catholic, has never denied that the text of Scripture will plainly teach the message of salvation, because not all of Scripture is vague, unclear. A lot of it is very clear to the one who's trained and qualified. But you just got done saying in the beginning that you are here trying to convince people the text of Scripture is sufficient in conveying the saving truths of God. But Saint Augustine is a saint of all the ancient churches. All churches that calls themselves Catholic, Oriental, Eastern Orthodox, right? Catholic Church. Well, Orientals, yeah, you would have to, because even Cyril of Alexandria said he's our brother. Nonetheless, let's say Oriental and Assyrian Church reject him. That's fine. Eastern Orthodox Catholics say St. Augustine is our saint. And he's Catholic. Catholic in the sense that all these churches say they're Catholic, universal. Because it's in the Nicene Creed, one holy apostolic Catholic Church. Why then did you give the impression to the audience that Catholics, because they reject sola scriptura, mean to suggest that nothing is clear in Scripture, or that you cannot learn what salvation is from Scripture, because there's nothing in Scripture that is clear enough to convey the message of salvation? Why did he do that? Why did he do that? Right? And is this the same Augustine that believed in purgatory, believed in the Eucharist as a propitiatory sacrifice for post-baptismal sins, believed in water baptismal regeneration, and said, I would never dare attribute any sins to the Holy Mother of the Lord? He would never dare even think about whether she had committed any personal sin? Who believed in veneration of saints and communion of saints? Who believed all that? That Augustine? From the plain reading of the perspicuous Scriptures? All right. Anyway, I'm going to make it worse for him in a minute.
Workmen who are diligent, who don't need to be ashamed.
Workmen, so qualified individuals, not just any Joe Schmo where you put the Bible in their hand. That's exactly what the Catholics are trying to say. God established a church, and this church has bishops taught by the apostles, filled with the Spirit, and then the Spirit empowered them to then appoint bishops filled with the Spirit, and appoint bishops. And it was through that process that the church preserved the canon of Scripture, the interpretation of Scripture, the application of Scripture. That's what it's saying. So you cannot understand what are the essential doctrines of faith, and he proved it. Apart from that church entrusted with the Scriptures, where it does talk about salvation in many places in a plain manner, but nonetheless, still, you can't understand what the essential doctrines of the faith are that you must affirm without the church explicating the Scriptures. But to begin with, they first need to tell you what those Scriptures are that they're explicating, because as he discombobulated, he couldn't even tell you what the essential doctrines are for Protestants, because to him, he said, water baptism isn't essential for salvation until Trent stopped them saying, what about Lutherans and Anglicans? They say you're wrong. In fact, the unanimous teaching of the church for 1,500 years is that water baptism saves you, regenerates you. Unanimous teaching of the church. And what about all the Baptists that said, we don't agree with you that not baptizing your infants is a great sin. Not only do they reject water baptism regeneration, which you do, but Luther didn't, Anglicans don't, and the church for over 1,500 years didn't reject it, neither did Augustine, but they went against you, saying you're wrong to baptize infants because it's not taught plainly in Scripture, and therefore it's not a grave sin. So what did you have to say? Well, noetic effects of sin, as you said, Trent. They're partially blind. They have cataracts. In other words, I see better than them. Why? Because I so happen to embrace Presbyterianism, and I know I made the right choice and you made the wrong choice. He becomes his own pope. See what he did?
So this word is generally clear. There are some things that require work, and some of those issues are things like baptism. So all my Baptist friends here today, you need to work harder, right? And I need to do better getting the word out to my fellow Presbyterian brothers and sisters to turn up to these things so that more hands can be up.
How does he know which parts of Scripture are not clear? How does he know that? He just buried himself. He just tried to go into damage control because he said that if you have eyes to see and you don't have spiritual cataracts, partially blind, you can see, it's clear in Scripture, baptizing infants. The Baptists say, no, it's not. That's one of the unclear, vague teachings of the New Testament. You're taking what is vague and trying to make it clear. Who's right? Who's right? Do you see what he just did again, right? I need to work at my Baptist friends, and I need to get my Presbyterian brothers to work harder so that we all raise our hands up saying, yeah, infant baptism. So you see again the circle. Yeah, the Bible is generally clear, but there are some things that are difficult. Who determines the clear from the unclear? Anthony said it is a clear teaching that when you baptize households, like they did in the New Testament, that includes infants. Baptists say that is unclear and vague because you assume that those households ipso facto necessarily had infants to be baptized. And you guys thought he won? You really thought he won, huh? But I'm going to make it a lot worse, this shish kebab. Let me just finish.
When Trent does the audience participation stuff. But the main thing I'm trying to convey to you, though, is that you can trust this word. You don't need a pope to interpose himself between you and your...
How do you know what the word is? To trust. And then notice the cheap shots. He cannot defend his position, so let's attack the pope. And then Trent, in the beginning minute, schools him on it, and I'm going to bury him. He schooled him, I'm going to cremate him. How do you know what the word is that you can trust? See the circle again? But you don't need a pope. But pope simply means father, a spiritual father, and the pope is simply the bishop of Rome. So you're telling me the church at Rome didn't need a bishop? So you're telling me the New Testament that appoints bishops to oversee the flock and rule over the flock in order to preserve sound doctrine and protect the flock from heresies and heretics and wolves and tools of Satan like you was unnecessary? So that Peter, Paul did not know what they were doing by appointing bishops to succeed them? Because the Lord was not going to continue the office of apostle or prophet indefinitely. Their replacement were the bishops. So you're telling me your New Testament is wrong. Your New Testament is wrong for saying bishops were appointed in every area to replace the apostles when they died, because the same spirit that filled the apostles filled them to preserve the deposit of faith they heard orally from them and preserve the scriptures they received from them in order to teach it correctly so the flock would not be deceived by false teachers like Anthony, this tool of Satan preaching a false gospel like James White. That's wrong? Because the Pope simply means father, and it's the title of the Bishop of Rome. You're telling me they made a mistake in appointing bishops everywhere and the Bishop of Rome? You're telling me Irenaeus was wrong for praising the Roman city for having preeminence by virtue of the fact two apostles went there and appointed the first bishop of Rome and died as martyrs there and were buried there? Irenaeus was wrong?